and I know of people like that work in these newsrooms. They look for people having exactly the kinds of skills that you have after you take these classes. Okay, so slight detour, but now let's continue with storytelling. Or any other comments or questions about election visualization? So if not, quick recap, storytelling with data. Storytelling is about underscoring your arguments with data and facts, about leveraging the power of visualization to show trends, to show correlations, outliers, or convey magnitudes. We looked at the video of Al Gore using this crane to make a point to underscore this trend that he thinks should concern us. But so here's basically a poster style infographic that we went through and kind of like just the main pieces of a data story. So compared to just like a visualization of data, these data stories have rich annotations, they have good legends, they have labeling, and so on. And so here we have an introduction that kind of like tells us the premise of the chart. Then we have context and the legend that gives us more information about what is in this chart exactly. Then we have the main story. In this case, this was about the suspicion that one of those baseball players here used steroids to be actually able to hit as many home runs as he did. It's that late in his career. Then we have annotations of key points, and that kind of lets people dig into the story and engage with it. Then we have context, where they use matching on content and on visual styles in terms of color and trend. And then we have more in-depth information using a multi-messaging approach. Then we divided up different types of data stories. So we talked about these 7 genres here: magazine style, annotated chart, petition poster, flowchart, comic strip, slideshow, and film video animation. And so in the exercise that we'll be doing in a minute, I'll be asking you to tease the genres apart for 3 different visualizations. And then we have the spectrum of who is in charge of telling the story. Is it the author of the story, that would be the case in a video, because it's a linear sequence of facts and visualizations and narration? Or is it reader-driven, where we essentially have something for people to explore, maybe certainly with rich annotations, but not necessarily a predefined ordering? And so there are these special types of structures that we call the martini glass structure, where we start off with something author-driven, where the main message is conveyed, but then you can explore more in a data set and maybe make it relevant to your personal situation. We have these interactive slideshows that are split into multiple scenes, and they allow interaction midway. And then we have these drill-down stories where the reader decides which path to follow, but all paths are annotated. And then we talked about a couple of strategies for storytelling. We had these layout principles: descriptive titles, descriptive subtitles, annotation, using saturation, and also messaging. Instead of neutral presentation of data, highlight something through contrast and through text that you think is an important piece of the story. We talked about interactivity, types of interactivity. We also talked about this stuff when we talked about interaction. So we have steppers, scrolling, play, forward, rewind, and so on. We have details on demand. So if I hover over something or if I select something, I get more information. And then we had these classes of making it relevant to the reader. What do you think? Who are you? Where do you live? We had this example with the weather, where we could look at how was the year 2015 in the city, where you grew up or where you currently live. And they had this whole data set available for many, many thousands of cities. And so basically making the visualization, the content relevant to a very broad audience on a local scale. And then we had this asking for opinions or prior knowledge example that you draw in things. And then basically how this works is you're asked a question, and the people are challenged about their knowledge or about their ideas or maybe about their stereotypes. And then this is juxtaposed with what really is in the data, or what other people think. And so there are a couple of examples like this. Okay, so now I want to do this exercise about analyzing stories. You'll need a computer for that, so if you brought one, bring one out. If you didn't bring one, sit down with one of your neighbors. And so there's 3 different stories that I would like you to analyze. There's the 1.5 million missing black men, the one about climate change, and then finally, basically the solution to Homework 6 design part, how states have shifted. So take a look at those, and then I'll give you 10 minutes and we'll discuss them.
They showed me a concert. Oh, DC, yeah.
It's very flat. I don't know about that. I looked at the data.
Okay, so let's talk about this. We have three different stories, and they're also quite different in terms of how they tell the story. So this one is the first one. We have this 1.5 million missing black man. So what does the data show here? Like, what's the story about? Anybody? Yeah.
How black men are disproportionately ending up in jail or killed or dying of heart disease.
Exactly. And so, what is the genre of this story? So if we look at like the website, we see here some animation. Well, there's a little bit of animation, but there's no interactivity, right? And then we have text. And so, what is the genre? Like a magazine, annotated chart, petition poster, flowchart, comic strip, slideshow, video.
You said magazine?
I think that's right. It's really, like, it's almost like a research paper, right? We have figures and then text, and the figures are not particularly interactive. There's nothing to drill down into. So it's more of like a juxtaposition of, here's a figure that shows some data, here's text that describes the figure. So it's traditional magazine style. Is the story here author or reader driven? Author, yes. It's a completely linear story. You start at the top, you read it, you look at the figures when they're placed in the text. So that's clearly author driven. Any particular structure, such as martini class, interactive slideshow, drill down? Not really, right? Is it opinionated or neutral?
We thought it was opinionated. Okay, yeah, you very much, I want you to walk away thinking like, this is terrible, I should do something about it.
Yeah, so it clearly has a message, right? It doesn't try to do neutral data presentation, or like, here's data of incarceration and death in the United, or like premature death in the United States. It clearly has a message, so it's clearly opinionated. Do you think it uses titles, legends, highlights, and so on well? Interactivity? Like, was it hard to understand?
We didn't care for its US map that it used, especially with the color coding. We kind of got confused between the different shades of gray and the colors that they got going on.
Yeah. Know what you mean. So here there are some issues about, I guess the shades of gray are probably missing data.
Yeah, and then they have darker shades that actually represent data.
Yes. So here this is like tricky to see, is this gray or is this a data, is this no data or like a shade of pink here. So generally, is it well designed? I agree that the color code choice here is the best, but the other. My scrolling is good. But the other parts are, like in my opinion, fairly reasonably designed, right? It's like these charts here. They use this technique that we talked about. That instead of having like just proportions, they use like specific numbers that are more relatable, like 14 missing black men for every 100 black women. So like we have, like instead of saying that 40%, like there's 40% more women than men, it gives you like this related to specific numbers, and it does a fair, like a decent job of visualizing this data. So this one, the Earth orbit, we've looked at this before. What's the, like, if you didn't look at it, here's, like, basically you have, in the scroll, and then you see different hypotheses about what is changing or what is causing global warming. So, what's the genre of this? Annotated chart? Annotated chart is like more of like, well, you could say it, but it's also, I would say, some other form. Yeah.
To me, it seems like a slideshow.
Yeah, I think it's mostly a slideshow. I think it's an annotated chart within the slides, but I would say it's mostly a slideshow. Is it author or reader driven? Author, yes. So there is like a linear way to go through this, and that's like very like not completely enforced. There's this stepper interface here where I could jump, but mostly people are probably expected to go through this linearly. Is there a particular structure? Martini glass, interactive slideshow, drill down. Interactive slideshow, yes. So we can hover and explore once we've arrived at a state, look a little bit more at each of these slides. Does it have a good introduction? Yeah, so there's text, and then it's also basically it kind of brings in the data over time, which is kind of also how they introduce the data. So that could be like considered a fairly good introduction. Is it opinionated or neutral? I hear neutral. Everybody agree with that? I guess it's fact-based, but it also has a message, right? So I think all of these stories, all good data stories, are fact-based, but are probably not completely neutral because they have a point they want to make. And generally, do you think this is titles, legends, highlights, interactivity? This is all well done?
I don't know, like I haven't seen it since we did it, but was the x-axis labeled in each case? Is it like a percentage or something?
The y-axis.
Oh, sorry, yeah, the y-axis.
Yeah, here it says hotter, like in this case for temperature. And then if we bring in more, it actually does not label the concentration of whatever, like, or the rotation of this. No, actually, I think this is all temperature. This is like the effect of this particular thing, like the changes in solar radiation on temperature. So I think it is labeled correctly. But you could think of other units to use if you wanted to just like talk about solar radiation or ozone or whatever there is. But that kind of makes it simple. Like orbital changes, you could measure them maybe in degree. But if you break it down to the effect on temperature, then you can use the same legend here. Okay, so is the visualization generally well designed? Yeah, it's like fairly well done. So the next one, something that you might be like the problem you might be quite familiar with. That's basically a homework 6 design part. And that's kind of what inspired us to ask this question about homework 6. And so if you, like, that's, I think, a great solution to the question in homework 6. And so, like, this is how states have shifted over decades. And so we can see this was, like, made in 2012 when the Obama-Romney election was on. And you can see for each state, like here we have California. California has been reliably Democratic since 1988. So we see that these swings between states over time. And there are some really interesting patterns here that, for example, Alabama swung from like Kennedy to Goldwater with like a massive difference in absolute votes and so on. So there's a couple of interesting effects to observe here. But let's talk about this from a storytelling perspective. What's the genre here? I hear annotated chart. Everybody agree with that? Yeah, I think that's an annotated chart. It's not a poster. because it's not partitioned, or it's not a partition poster because it's really mostly about this one data set. And clearly it's none of the others. Is it author or reader driven? Reader driven, yeah. So it's really, like, other than from recent to like further in the past, it doesn't really impose like a direction how you would explore it, right? So you can go through it and pick out something that you find interesting. Can you make out a particular structure? Is it a martini glass, interactive slideshow, or drill down?
So it's kind of like the drill down, you can cover, you get details about states and kind of follow them.
Exactly. So I think it's a drill down story. You can basically like hover like a state. You can also highlight toss-ups here. So they have kind of built in a lot of things for you to investigate on your own and drill down about it. Is this opinionated or neutral? Yeah, I'd say that's probably as neutral as it gets, right? This is really a presentation of facts without like necessary messaging. It's really, there's no like, see how Democrats are losing control of whatever. It's really how states have shifted over time. So that's one of the more neutral examples that you would see in a newspaper. What do you think about legends, titles, highlights, interactivity? Yeah, I think that's, like, generally, as I already mentioned, I think that's...
To annotate, do we just kind of, do we state that? Do we just leave it alone?
Well, I would be surprised if you don't find anything, right? And you probably know a little bit more about your data than is immediately obvious. Not every data set is going to be equally interesting to annotate or like have equally much, right? There's always a balance. Like if you have an amazing visualization system, but don't have much in terms of storytelling and annotations, you're still going to get a good grade. So basically, just find a balance between those things, and if you realize that there's nothing that you can tell a story about, I would A, be surprised, but then just invest a little bit more time in making it a good visualization system. And like, notice that this is all, like all of these annotations are, all of these storytelling devices are specific to the data set, right? We like, in visualization research, we often build tools that are generic. So here I could apply something like this to any country. I could upload data from any country, like say how are all the states in different countries voting historically, but that you could not reuse the annotation. So the annotation is really part of the data, more or less, and so kind of like something that you add to the data yourself. Okay, so now for something completely different. So we'll be spending probably like the next 2.5 or 3 lectures on graphs. And so, what's a graph? Anybody?
Set up nodes and
Edges, yes. Yeah, so we have nodes and edges. So basically, graphs are about relationships between items. Remember we had this definition. So I want to start out again with an exercise. Here is a data set that I made up about a co-authorship. So we have a couple of nodes, Carolina, Mariah, Alex, Sean, Mark, Niels, and Sylvia. And then we have links and attributes about those links. And so there's a link between Carolina and Alex, one between Sean and Mariah, Mariah and Alex, Alex and Sean, Alex and Niels, Alex and Mark, and so on. And so I would like you guys to design 2 completely different visualizations using this simple data set. There's more instructions on the handout here.
Killing the trees, huh?
Yeah, I got mine.
Maybe like the size. think that's probably the
Okay, so what are the visualization techniques that you came up with here? What are your designs? Anybody want to describe what they did?
So one of them, I kind of I did like circles with like the area, the number of papers and like chords, the diameter portion represents the number of papers that they share.
Okay, so you have every person is a circle, and the circle is sized proportionally to the number of papers. And then you have the links, like basically chords between them, and the width of the chords is sized proportionally to how many papers they co-authored. So yeah, that's like what's called a node link diagram. That's kind of the canonical graph visualization, right? So it's a good approach here. What is the other? Anybody has a different design?
Cyclical chord chart where each author is around the front of the circle, and then the connections, the width of them are based off of how many co-authorships of those two connections have.
Yeah, so the circular layout where every author is a segment of the circle, and then we have like ribbons that correspond to the number of papers that they co-authored. Is this correct? Yeah.
We found like a parallel coordinates or parallel axes or whatever with primary author on the first side, secondary on the right side, and then a bin for each person. So you can basically see like the density of, lines going out the primary side tell you how many papers that person has been a primary author.
Cool. So that's kind of like a variation of a node link diagram where you have people duplicated. So it's really more about you focused on the first author, second author relationship essentially. Anybody use the table? What do you do with the table?
Diagonal can be like the single papers and rest of the columns will be the partnership. So it is not, if they are not worked or anything, then it's easy.
So what do you do with the cells? You fill the cells in which condition? Or
So the diagonal will be this only one of the papers because
okay.
people match and other sets will be like dependent on whether these two combination of authors which make up that set that co-author paper.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know if this fits, but it's stem leaf plot.
Stem leaf plots. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Just like left side had just bins of 0 to 10, all the way up to 10. And the right side.
Okay, so that means you mostly focused on the connectivity and kind of like showed us how many papers are co-authored by those people. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Cool. So there's a lot of variation. I'm glad we had the two most common graph visualization techniques in there. And I want to talk about the tasks with you after I've shown you these examples. And so the first one here is this one. So that's kind of like your standard, right? If I tell you, hey, take this data and draw a graph, this is probably what you do. So you have bubbles, and I was lazy. I didn't scale them exactly by size, so I didn't actually use good visual encoding here. I used labels instead. But that's one way to do it. And then the other one here is called an adjacency matrix. And an adjacency matrix is essentially here you have all your authors in rows and the same authors again in columns. And then we show attributes about the authors that are just unique to the authors and don't have anything to do with the connections. We can show them in here. And then for every connection there is, we show a filled-in cell, and then we show how many connections there are. In this case, using like the glyph, the number, but in practice you could do something like color coding or like color coding by saturation. I should be precise here. Okay, so these two are kind of like the most important graph visualization techniques. Now, I want to ask you a question like, how is Sean connected to Sylvia? How would you read this from this chart? It's not. It's not, but I also mean about distance. Yeah?
So you find out all connections which Sean has, and then for all those connections, you declare their connections until you use it.
Yes. So, is that easy?
Yeah, if you have node-based graph, then it's kind of easy.
Well, no, for this chart here. So it's really hard to do without a pen, right? Do you go? Oh, sorry. Any other? So yeah, so this question is difficult to answer. But here, how is Sean connected to Sylvia? Well, it's fairly easy. I see the two nodes and I kind of like mentally move in the right direction, right? So I can see connectivity quite well in the node link layout. I can't see connectivity well in the matrix layout. Who has the most connections in the network? Yeah, so I drew this chart slightly egocentric, so I have the most connections here. And that's fairly easy to see because we see the edges, right? How do I spot that here? Yeah, exactly. So I can see that the rows, like my rows are pretty full. And so I would say those, like, it's actually equally easy to see between the two charts how many connections a specific node has. Which two authors collaborate the most? Is that easy to see in this chart? Yeah, so we basically have to look at the values and find the edge that has the highest value. And so if I use some kind of like color saturation here, that would be the darkest cell. If I have this chart here, it's also fairly easy to see with the numbers, but we know that like we have a lot less bandwidth when we draw links. So there's only like a limited number of link width that I can distinguish. So in practice, it turns out that for these kinds of things, node link diagrams are a little bit trickier to use than matrices. And then in this chart, who is only loosely connected to the network? Yeah, we can see that Sylvia has only one connection. And we can see that even better, I would say, here. So kind of like what we quickly see, if we compare those two chart types, they have different strengths and weaknesses. So generally, I would say that for edge attributes, matrices are better. For identifying neighborhoods, matrices are better. And for looking at topology, anything beyond immediate neighborhoods, node link diagrams are better. And then there's, of course, a lot of subtlety to the whole thing. That's what I'll be talking about now. But let's do a couple of formal definitions. So first, what's the difference between a graph and a network? It's kind of a trick question, so there isn't really one. There is, you can make a bit of an argument that you say graph is the mathematical, theoretical construct, and network is like a specific instance, so you would say a social network, but you would say graph analysis tasks. But that's very subtle, and you can mostly use them interchangeably. And graphs are actually quite common. So like, even though they're kind of like not as common as tabular data when we do data analysis, they are actually very common in our daily lives because they describe these relationships, and everything that we do, everything that is in nature has relationship with something else, right? So here are just a couple of examples. PageRank, the internet. The internet is a big network. PageRank is an algorithm that makes use of this network. We have integrated circuits, which are by definition networks. So we have like these like electronic networks. We have road networks, and we can use navigation software to find path in these road networks. And of course, we have social networks, be it Facebook, Twitter, or real-life interactions, familial relationships, and so on. This is the Facebook network. And so, what do you see in here? So yeah, China is missing. You also see, basically, what other thing that you can see is that it's kind of like a bit of a proxy for population, right? So you see that there are, like in Russia has Facebook, but Russia still is very sparsely populated in the northeastern part, so you don't see much of Russia here. But could you tell what is my social network from this chart? No, so it's really more of like a frequency chart and less of a chart that's about connections. What you can see though is that here there are quite some connections from Hawaii to the mainland US, and there are a fair number of connections from the US to Europe, and of course from the US to South America. So we can see like all these kinds of connections, but it's really hard to spot any super strong trends, I would say. Another big domain for networks are biological networks, and biological networks capture things as complex as interaction between genes, proteins, and chemical products. Like we know that, for example, proteins often work in chains, like one protein produces some kind of output that is then the input to another process, and so we have these sequences and these interactions. The brain is really just like one big network, and we have these connections between the neurons. So here is this is actually a 3D rendering of a neuron and how it connects with dendrites and so on. And here's the same data, well, not exactly the same data, but the same, like, this is contained in this one. Here's a very specific representation of how this looks like in a mouse brain. And here's a very abstract representation of this mouse brain, of how these types of neurons are connected. So we can kind of like switch between different granularities based on our questions. Of course, ancestry, like the relationships between you and your family, are networks. And Utah is a great place to study these ancestries because we have these very, very detailed records that are kept by the Mormon Church. So everybody who has a driver's license in Utah is in the Utah population database. So most of you guys, even though you probably moved to Utah, or some of you moved to Utah only recently, if you have a driver's license, you're already in the data set that we can use here at the University of Utah to study like population health questions. And then phylogeny. Trees are graphs, and phylogenies are trees. So kind of like the relationship between species, how species evolved from like one source of life. These trees of life, they're an interesting research question for networks as well. This is how, like a 2000s version of the metabolic network of a human. And that's actually like in my previous job, I had this poster on the wall. And that's how the complex the network is, just for breaking down, like for keeping your metabolic system and your body up to date. And so these are mostly chemicals and how they react with each other. And you could actually, like in a map, look up a specific protein, and then it would say like go to A4, and then there you would find the protein. Nowadays we have like tools that help you do these kinds of things. And I want to show this interesting social network analysis example here. It's a TED Talk.
For me, this story begins about 15 years ago when I was a hospice doctor at the University of Chicago. And I was taking care of people who were dying and their families in the south side of Chicago. And I was observing what happened to people and their families over the course of their terminal illness. And in my lab, I was studying the widower effect, which is a very old idea in the social sciences, going back 150 years, known as dying of a broken heart. So when I die, my wife's risk of death can double, for instance, in the first year. And I had gone to take care of one particular patient, a woman who was dying of dementia. And in this case, unlike this couple, she was being cared for by her daughter. And the daughter was exhausted from caring for her mother. And the daughter's husband, he also was sick from his wife's exhaustion. And I was driving home one day, and I get a phone call from the husband's friend, calling me because he was depressed about what was happening to his friend. So here I get this call from this random guy that's having an experience that's being influenced by people at some social distance. And so I suddenly realized two very simple things. First, the widowhood effect was not restricted to husbands and wives. And second, it was not restricted to pairs of people. And I started to see the world in a whole new way, like pairs of people connected to each other. And then I realized that these individuals would be connected into foursomes with other pairs of people nearby. And that in fact, these people were embedded in other sorts of relationships, marriage and spousal and friendship and other sorts of ties. And that in fact, these connections were vast. And that we were all embedded in this broad set of connections with each other. So I started to see the world in a completely new way, and I became obsessed with this. I became obsessed with how it might be that we're embedded in these social networks and how they affect our lives. So social networks are these intricate things of beauty, and they're so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, that one has to ask what purpose they serve. Why are we embedded in social networks? I mean, how do they form? How do they operate? And how do they affect us? And so my first topic with respect to this was not death, but obesity. And it had become trendy to speak about the obesity epidemic. And along with my collaborator, James Fowler, we began to wonder whether obesity really was epidemic, and could it spread from person to person like the 4 people I discussed earlier. So this is a slide of some of our initial results. It's 2,200 people in the year 2000. Every dot is a person. We make the dot size proportional to people's body size. So bigger dots are bigger people. And in addition, if your body size, if your BMI, your body mass index is above 30, if you're clinically obese, we also color the dots yellow. So if you look at this image right away, you might be able to see that there are clusters of obese and non-obese people in the image. But the visual complexity is still very high. It's not obvious exactly what's going on. In addition, some questions are immediately raised. How much clustering is there? Is there more clustering than would be due to chance alone? How big are the clusters? How far do they reach? And most importantly, what causes the clusters? So we did some mathematics to study the size of these clusters. This here shows on the y-axis the increase in the probability that a person is obese given that a social contact of theirs is obese. And on the x-axis, the degrees of separation between the two people. And on the far left, you see the purple line. It says that if your friends are obese, your risk of obesity is 45% higher. And the next bar over, the orange line, says if your friends' friends are obese, your risk of obesity is 25% higher. And then the next line over says if your friends, someone you probably don't even know is obese, your risk of obesity is 10% higher. And it's only when you get to your friends, that there's no longer a relationship between that person's body size and your own body size. Well, what might be causing this clustering? There are at least 3 possibilities. One possibility is that as I gain weight, it causes you to gain weight, a kind of induction, a kind of spread from person to person. Another possibility, very obvious, is homophily, or birds of a feather flock together. Here, I form my tie to you because you and I share a similar body size. And the last possibility is what is known as confounding, because it confounds our ability to figure out what's going on. And here the idea is not that my weight gain is causing your weight gain, nor that I preferentially form a tie with you because you and I share the same body size, but rather that we share a common exposure to something like a health club that makes us both lose weight at the same time. And when we studied these data, we found evidence for all of these things, including for induction. And we found that if your friend becomes obese, it increases your risk of obesity by about 57% in the same given time period. And there can be many mechanisms for this effect. One possibility is that your friends say to you something like, they adopt a behavior that spreads to you, like they say, let's go have muffins and beer. which is a terrible combination. But you adopt that combination, and then you start gaining weight like them. And another more subtle possibility is that they start gaining weight, and it changes your ideas of what an acceptable body size is. And here, what's spreading from person to person is not a behavior, but rather a norm. An idea is spreading. Now, headline writers had a field day with our studies. I think the headline in the New York Times was, are you packing it on? Blame your fat friends. What was interesting to us is the European headline writers had a different take. They said, are your friends gaining weight? Perhaps you are to blame. And
Okay. So this is an interesting illustration of these network effects, and there is this field of study that's called network science that really is concerned with these problems, and I find all of those topics quite interesting. Before we do talk more about graph visualization, I want to talk about a couple of graph theory fundamentals. There is a book by Barabasi, which is online, this network science book that is like for all of these mathematical definitions, essentially complementing what I'm saying here, but it will also have the introduction. So graph theory goes back to the Königsberg Bridge problem in 1736. And that was a problem. Basically, Königsberg is now a city in Russia. And back then, the question, like Königsberg had this river that ran through it, and a couple of islands in that river. So you have like the landmass to the north, the landmass to the south, then the island in the middle, and then an island here on the east side. And then you had these 7 bridges that connected these different segments on land. And the question was, can you take a walk through Königsberg where you cross every bridge exactly once, and not more than that? And I see people shaking their heads. Try tracing it mentally. It turns out you can't. But how do we know that this is true in general? And so Leonhard Euler was the person who studied this problem, and by doing so, invented the basics of graph theory. And he found that this is all first, a couple of observations that he made. It doesn't matter which path you take on the islands. So that's completely irrelevant to the question. I can take whatever path I want to take on land. It only matters which sequence of bridges I take. And so he could abstract away the land to nodes. And then he treated the bridges as edges. And so now we've abstracted this geospatial problem to a graph problem. And then he showed that it's not possible to, this is called a Hamiltonian path. It's not possible to walk a Hamiltonian path in a graph with an odd number of links, except for the graph with only 2 nodes. And so that's kind of like the foundations of graph theory. This graph has 4 nodes and an odd number of links, and therefore that's not possible. So if we abstract this graph away, like this from the geospatial dimension, we get this graph, and here you can trace, you can basically try to do the same thing without having to worry about the path on land. Okay, so a couple of definitions. A graph, we have a set of vertices, which we also call nodes. I'm going to use them interchangeably, and a set of edges, also called links, that connect these vertices. So that's, I think, fairly intuitive, and we talked already about the graphs and networks are mostly used interchangeably. We distinguish between general and simple graphs. A general graph is a graph which contains no multi-edges. So this here is a multi-edge. We have 2 edges connecting 2 nodes, and no self-loops. So this should be self-loops, not loops. We distinguish between undirected and directed graphs. So some graphs have directionality, some don't. Can you give me an analogy in social networks? Which social networks are directed, which are undirected? Facebook is directed?
Mutual.
So yes, but the basics of Facebook. So yes, Facebook is undirected. If we are friends, we are mutual friends. Twitter is directed. I follow somebody, somebody doesn't have to follow me back. So that's kind of the difference here. A hypergraph is an edge that is a graph with edges connecting any number of vertices. So that's not like A connects to B connects to C, but it's one single edge connecting all of A, B, and C in one swoop. So there's no order or anything in between that. And it's also helpful to think of these hyperedges as sets. So these are set relationships between nodes. An independent set contains no edges, and the clique, which is probably more interesting, contains all possible edges. So we have a lot of networks that are cliques. For example, if you look at migration patterns between US states, that's a completely connected network, right? Like there's enough people so that people even move from Rhode Island to Alaska. There is an edge in every single for every single possible combination, and those have unique properties, or let's say the density of a network is very important in the choice of visualization techniques. An unconnected graph is a graph where we have components that don't have an edge, where I can travel from a certain dot to another one. And an articulation point is a special vertex that, if I were to delete that vertex, would separate the graph into two unconnected parts. A biconnected graph is a graph where we don't have any articulation points. So let's assume I delete any node in this graph up there. We still have a completely connected network. And that's, of course, important for things like the internet. We don't want one server to go down and suddenly there would be no connection between different parts of the internet. So we need redundancy and links for certain types of graphs. And the bipartite graphs are graphs where we have two different node types, and the connections in the graph are only between the nodes of the different types. So a simple example of that would be authors and papers. Like an author writes a paper, and so there's a connection, and the author, and then another author is also on the paper, and so there's a connection not directly between the authors, but they are connected via the paper. So that's also an important graph class, and of course there's generalizations that are called k-partite graphs of that. Like a very important special graph class is the tree. A tree is, in its basic definition, a graph with no cycles, or a collection of nodes that contains a root node and 0 to n subtrees. And the subtrees are connected to a root by an edge. So strictly speaking, a tree doesn't have to have a root, but mostly like this here is still a tree. Because like any of those nodes could be the root of the tree, but mostly we think of graphs or of trees as being rooted. Trees are also like graphs usually don't have order. So there is no order between, like in a general graph, but trees very often have order. So here, if we have an ordered tree, those two examples here would be different. If it were unordered, the order were irrelevant, they would be identical. So here I've switched F and E for the children of B. And so there is like many different named graph classes. There's thousands of them, and there's books about that. But that does not concern us too much. A very important property of graphs are degrees. So the degree of a node is the number of edges connecting a node. And for a directed graph, we separately treat in and out degree because they are completely different concepts. And so, like, if you want to know something about the graph, like without actually visualizing it, you can look at the degree distribution and then the average degree. And the degree distribution, for example, here we have the degree distribution for the graph up there. For this one here, we see that there is 25% of the nodes have degree 1, 50% have degree 2, 25% have degree 3. Here we have a graph that's a ring, so all of those nodes have exactly degree 2. And so the degree distribution is an important property of a graph. And so here's a real network. That's a protein interaction network, and it's what's called a scale-free network. And these scale-free networks have hubs that have preferential attachments. So what you see is that most, like about 50% of all nodes in this network have very few nodes. And there's a couple of outliers that are very connected. And that's a property that you see a lot in networks. There's different types of networks, but scale-free networks that have these like hubs are a very important network class. Degree is a measure of local importance. So I can be like, for example, if I have a lot of friends, I have a high degree in a social network. But it doesn't mean that I'm globally important to the network. Degree is really only a local measure. So here in this network of Les Miserables characters, we see that Muriel here, she has a fairly high degree, but all of her neighbors are not very connected. So she's important locally, but she's not important globally for the graph. In contrast to Valjean, who's the main character of the story, he's important both locally and globally. We can better measure global importance by a measure that's called betweenness centrality. And betweenness centrality is calculated by counting the number of shortest paths that go through a particular node. So that's like a fairly simple algorithm, and that gives you like a good measure for the overall relevance of a node to the graph. And so here you see that the main character here, Valjean, is very important to that network, and so he has a high betweenness centrality. If you plot the distribution of those two networks, you will see that like in the degree distribution, we have like a flatter distribution. We have like more people with like a degree of 15 or 20. Between the centrality, we quickly get these like massive outliers because these are the important hubs. A path, like path and distances are also very often important things to consider when we look at networks. A path is a route along links, and the path length is the number of links that are contained in that route. And the shortest path connects two nodes with the smallest possible number of links. And we can measure shortest path just by the number of links, but we could also consider edge attributes if we wanted to. And then we have another measure that tells us something about the graph, the diameter of the graph. That's the longest, shortest path in G. And so this, like right before we start this visualization, our time is up. And so I'll continue here on Thursday, and we'll talk about graph visualization. If you want to